What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video about the basics of combat in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. Now, most of this should apply to Kingmaker as well, but I am making this specifically for Wrath of the Righteous, so take that for what you will. Moreover, if you're a veteran, I don't know what you're expecting to get out of this video. Thank you for watching, but also, again, this is about the super basics of combat, just like how attack rolls work, that kind of stuff. With that out of the way, let's dive into this. So first things first, I want to start with ability scores. Ability scores are from 0 to 20 at a base, and then there are modifiers that can affect that. Now, typically speaking, you're never going to see an ability score all the way down to 0, outside of like being undead or something, which for instance, you just wouldn't have a constitution modifier at all. And even then, it's not even technically 0, you just don't have one. But for every 2 points, an ability score is over 10, with 10 being like average of an ability score. Every 2 something is over that, so say 12, you'll start getting +1 for each 2 that it's over 10 to modifiers. So 12 would be +1, 14 would be +2, 16 is +3, etc. Now, we'll get into what those modifiers are for here in just a minute, but we're going to start with talking about strength. Points in strength and the modifier from it affects melee attack rolls, damage rolls on melee and thrown weapons, and while it doesn't affect the attack roll for ranged, it will incur a penalty if you don't have enough strength. So just to give a quick example, if I'm firing a bow with 12 strength, I won't get the +1 damage to that from my strength. However, I will get a penalty if I said had 8 and therefore had a -1 modifier. I would actually take that penalty to my range damage roll, but I don't get the bonus for the rolls on ranged weapons, outside of thrown weapons. In addition, strength also affects things like athletics checks as well as just base strength checks. Then we have dexterity. Dexterity affects our ranged attack rolls, including for some spells. It can give a bonus to our armor class when we're not flat-footed. Again, I'll get into what flat-footed here is in a bit. It also affects our reflex defense. I'll cover that in a bit. Our mobility, trickery, and stealth checks as well, which are all skills. Now, Constitution is basically where we get our health die from. So this modifier affects how much health we get. It also affects our fortitude defense. And then we have Intelligence. Intelligence affects how many skill points we get each level for, putting into actual skills. It also affects our knowledge checks, which are part of the skills. Essentially, there's a couple different types of knowledge, and your character will roll an intelligence modifier for those checks, as well as granting certain class spells, such as for a wizard. Then we have Wisdom. Wisdom will affect our will checks, which is a defense type, our perception, as well as lore skill checks, as well as, again, some class spells. Now, Charisma affects our ability to use magic devices, channeling energy for certain classes, some class spells, such as a paladin or a bard, as well as being able to persuade people, as charisma is actually for. Now, so that is a breakdown of what each ability score will actually do. But what I'm talking about specifically with those is that's what the modifier affects. So again, for each 2 points we have above 10, we're going to get plus to something, or for every 2 levels below 10 we have, we're going to get minus something. That modifier is going to affect those skill rolls I just mentioned for each stat. So for instance, if I have 8 strength and I'm trying to, say, move a boulder or something else that would incur a strength check, I'm going to take a -1 to rolling on that check. Now, you also heard me reference skill checks as well as certain types of defensive checks there. The defensive checks I will get into a bit later in a separate portion of the video. However, the skill checks are pretty easy to explain. There's a variety of skills you get to put points in, such as persuasion, athletics, trickery, stealth. Trickery is like picking locks, by the way, and all sorts of things like that. And when you make a character, you'll get to put points dependent on your class and intelligence into those skills. The initial point put into a skill gives you a +4 to it, and then every subsequent point increases that by +1. That modifier from your skills gets applied in addition to your ability scores to your skill checks. So for instance, my mobility is a combination of my dexterity modifier as well as my mobility skills, as well as any other modifiers that might affect my mobility, such as wearing armor. Now, let's move on to attacking an enemy. So when it comes to attacking an enemy, first things first, we need to start with initiative. Now, in the games here, initiative isn't a huge deal, but it is still a thing. Now, for real time with pause, initiative is quite simply how fast you get to act at the start of combat. In turn-based, initiative is more like, who's going when kind of thing, basically whose turn it is. Whereas in real time with pause, it's just how quickly you get to fight at the start of combat. But outside of that, let's start talking about our attack bonuses. So attack bonuses basically come in two types, melee and spellcasting. For melee, we're talking about our base attack bonus. This is going to increase basically as you level up, and once this bonus reaches 6, 11, and 16, for each of those respectively, we get an extra attack per round. So how attack rolls wind up being rolled, and specifically what an attack roll is, by the way, is rolling to see if you hit something. It is separate from a damage roll. So first you got to roll to see if you hit, which is your attack roll, which is what your base attack bonus is going to be applied to. So for a melee attack, rolling to hit something is your base attack bonus, plus your strength, plus any other modifiers, versus the difficulty check. In the case of trying to hit something, the difficulty check is just your enemy's armor class for a regular melee attack. And we'll get into armor class in the defensive portion of this video. Suffice to say, that is how attack rolls, for the most part, are calculated. Now for a ranged attack, instead of using your strength modifier, you would use, of course, your dex modifier. And then we have criticals. So criticals in this game are rolled for into a threat range and then confirmed by a separate roll. So basically, if you roll to hit something, and you roll within your threat range, which is usually just 20, but some weapons will have a threat range of like 19 to 20. So if you roll in that threat range on an attack roll, you will potentially be able to critically hit. However, you have to roll a second attack roll that then just has to clear the enemy's AC to become a critical hit. Now, it's worth mentioning, if you roll a natural 20, it is always a hit. It might not necessarily be a critical if you miss your confirmation roll, but it will still hit and you'll roll regular damage. Now the opposite is true of a natural 1. So if you roll a natural 1, you'll just miss, guaranteed. Whereas a natural 20 will always hit. Now critical damage is, typically speaking, just a multiplied version of your weapon damage. Typically speaking, damage from other sources, such as precision damage, is not calculated into this. Now there's a lot of variance on that, but just know in general, criticals are multiplied by your weapon damage. So that's a real bare bones of how melee attacking works. So let's talk spellcasting. Now, spellcasting attack rolls work off of your caster level. Now, this is essentially just the level of the class that is giving you the ability to cast. Now, there are effects that will change this outside of just what it is. So there are modifiers from like spells and things which will affect your caster level. And then we have this thing called spell resistance. This is basically like the spell version of armor class. Not all spells will actually be affected by spell resistance, and the tooltip for the spell will usually tell you whether or not it is. So in order to hit something with a spell, you essentially have to roll a d20, add your caster level to it, and then compare that to the target's spell resistance. And that basically decides whether or not you hit the target with the spell. And then we have concentration. Concentration is essentially, the concentration it takes to cast a spell. So if you're hit or something while casting a spell, you have to roll a concentration check to not fail the spell. So essentially, a concentration check is your d20 plus caster level plus class spell modifiers. If you fail a concentration check, your spell just fails. It doesn't happen. And then there's spell failure. What happens then? So spell failure is just pretty straightforward. Your spell just doesn't work. However, in addition to failing a concentration check, this can also be caused by armor or other equipment. So the biggest thing is like heavy armor is going to have a arcane spell failure chance. This is what is going to cause your spells to fail. So if you're ever using a spell and it seems like it didn't do anything, if you look up your combat log, it more than likely just failed. Now, when it comes to spellcasting, I'm not going to get super into it, but suffice to say that some classes will be preparing spells every level. So when they get their new spells, they have to go to their spell book in the menu and prepare them, which essentially means assigning the spells you know to your spell slots. Spell slots are just the amount of spells at the appropriate spell level that you are able to cast. So again, some classes have to prepare them. So you have to go to your spell book and manually drag them to the spell slots. Others have spell uses per day, where essentially they can cast any spell they know at that level, but they can only do so many times per day. That is to say, per rest, really. So that's the basics of attacking with melee and spells, and now we're going to move on to defense. So it's important to note in Pathfinder, especially when you're talking about defense, because that bonuses do not stack of the same type typically. So for instance, if I'm wearing armor and I also have bracers of armor on, the bonuses from both of those things won't stack. I just get the bigger of the two. So before we even talk about defense, it's important to understand that you need to diversify your bonuses. However, luckily, Wrath of the Righteous will actually tell you if you are stacking bonuses that don't stack. So if you make the mistake of doing something like that, it will actually tell you that you're only getting the bigger bonus, and you can see that in the UI, as well as probably notice it in the armor class calculation if you mouse over it. Now let's talk about what armor class actually is. Armor class is essentially the difficulty check to hit you or an enemy with a spell or armor. We'll get into the various types of armor classes right now. So there's regular armor class, which is just standard rolls really. Then there's your flat-footed armor class. Flat-footed basically just means that you are in a situation where you cannot get your dexterity bonus to your armor class. And then, finally, we have our touch AC. Some spells and things like that don't require more than just touching someone. So touch attacks will just bypass your armor. So instead of including the armor in the difficulty roll of your touch AC, you just removed. So you don't get your armor bonus to the AC for attacks made against a touch attack. So to recap real quick, if you're being attacked by a touch attack, you don't get your armor bonus. If you are flat-footed, you don't get your dexterity bonus. That's the different types of AC, essentially. Now, touch attacks are pretty straightforward. Something's just physically touching you, and it doesn't require to bypass your armor in any way, such as certain spells. Then flat-footed has a few more caveats. So you can be caught flat-footed when your enemy is invisible, potentially, provided you don't have perks or abilities that mitigate that. You can also be caught flat-footed when you are flanked by enemies, and a few other instances. Now, that's important to know because if you are caught flat-footed, that typically opens you up to sneak attack damage if the enemy is capable of dealing it to you. Now that we have some of that out of the way, let's talk about how this is calculated. Your armor class is typically just a base of 10 plus your dexterity bonus, plus your armor bonus, plus any other modifiers. Modifiers are typically the stuff you're going to get from like accessories and stuff. So there's the armor you're wearing, of course, and then there's modifiers from like bracers and stuff that might give you a luck bonus to AC or a dodge bonus to AC instead of a regular bonus to AC. There are necklaces that will give you a natural armor bonus, which essentially just raises your base armor. So there is actually a lot going on with the armor portion of that calculation, because armor comes with a max dexterity bonus as well as an armor check penalty. Armor will cap your dexterity bonus to AC. So for instance, if I am wearing an armor that has a 3 max dexterity bonus, but I have a +5 modifier for my dexterity, what that +3 max dex means is that I can only get +3 to my AC from my dexterity while wearing this armor. Now, that may or may not matter in terms of giving me more AC. So in some cases, the actual armor from the armor is going to be so high that losing a couple points from my dex modifier to my AC is okay. And then armor also has what's called an armor check penalty. Now, this doesn't directly relate to your AC, but it's worth talking about right here. Armor check penalty is basically the minus to a skill check you get because you're wearing armor. So for instance, if you're trying to, be stealthy, but you're wearing heavy armor, that's going to come with a heavy armor check penalty, which is basically just a negative modifier to the skill check. So moving on to various other types of defense, now I'm going to talk about saving rolls. These are the fortitude, reflex, and will defense that I spoke about earlier. So the total for these defenses is a combination of your class bonus plus your stat modifiers, as well as other modifiers such as like a cloak of resistance or something. What each of these individual defenses do is potentially reduce or avoid the effects of magic or unusual attacks. So most magical attacks or something like that will have a saving throw attached to them. And essentially, fortitude, for instance, is like your internal fortitude. So, if something tries to make you sick, you will probably have a fortitude check against that to reduce or completely mitigate the effects of that spell. And then we have reflex defense, which is basically the defense where like getting out of the way quickly enough would mitigate the damage. And then there's will, which is typically like mind altering stuff. These are your saving throws against, again, magic. So if somebody throws a fireball at you, you're probably going to get a reflex save to potentially take like half damage from it. So guys, that is the basics of how to attack, how to defend yourself, how ability scores work, how skill checks work. Now at the end of this video here, which is right now, I'm going to wrap up some other things that I think are important, but don't really fit into any of the categories I mentioned above. So just kind of stuff that's useful to know. So we have speed. This is basically how far you can move in 3 seconds. So for most people, that's going to be like 20-ish feet. Then we have attacks of opportunity. Attacks of opportunity is basically where you use an opening in defenses to make an extra attack. So for instance, if you are moving past an enemy, if you're trying to grapple someone, if you're making a ranged attack right next to an enemy, all of that's going to provoke an attack of opportunity because you're lapsing your defenses to an enemy next to you. The same is also true of your characters. You will also get to make attacks of opportunity. Now typically you only get so many per round depending on a few various modifiers. I just mentioned per round, so what does that mean? When it comes to rounds in Pathfinder, a round is 6 seconds, and you get so many actions per round. Now in real time with pause, that's happening all at once, but turn-based, it's literally just your turn. There are a variety of action types. Typically speaking, a standard action and a move is pretty much your full round. However, you can potentially also use swift and free actions once per round as well. Now those action types, to sum them up, a standard action is basically like attacking or using an ability typically. Then you have your move action. This is obviously like various movement, so if you're drawing your weapon or drawing your bow, that kind of thing. And then we have full round abilities. Full round abilities do exactly that. They take the entire round. You can't do anything else. And then we have free and swift actions. Free actions, there is no cost. So think of a free action like knocking an arrow while you fired your bow. That would technically be a free action because it's so small, for instance, it's not even calculated. However, there are a variety of free actions essentially that you can use in combat. And then there are swift actions. These are where you're doing something, but it's essentially an instantaneous thing. So there are a lot of buffs in combat that are swift actions that you can use each round. For instance, at level 10, an assassin gets to use their poisons as a swift action, which basically means they can apply poison instantly and then use it in the same round. And then lastly, how does dying and death work? So dying is essentially when you hit 0 health points. This will put you down on the ground. You'll be unconscious. However, you won't die until your negative health is more than your constitution. So for instance, if I have like 14 constitution and I reach negative 14 health, that character is dead. Actually, one last thing before I forget about it. Then there is the concept of concealment. So concealment is basically a 20 or 50%, depending on if it's partial or full concealment, to just straight up miss a successful attack roll. So if I'm attacking something that is in concealment and I successfully hit it with my attack roll, there is a 20 to 50% chance I will then just miss it because of concealment. Now in the damage, this is like literally marked as concealment, so you'll know that you hit the target, but because of the concealment chance you missed. This applies to things like stealth and invisibility. There you go, guys. There is a roundup of a lot of the basic mechanics of how to attack and defend yourself in Pathfinder. So late game and more in-depth play of this game is essentially just extrapolating on these basic effects and understanding how they work. So personally, I find just a base understanding of the very low systems like this, where like just, how is it calculated whether or not I'm missing something, to be incredibly helpful. So to that end, I hope that it was helpful to you. As you probably saw throughout this video, the UI is pretty good about actually showing you these calculations in most cases. So hopefully, if nothing else, you learned where you can see to go look up your modifiers and why something is the way that it is. But with all that out of the way, I truly do hope you found this video useful. And moreover, I truly appreciate you watching this video. I hope you like, comment, subscribe, stick around. I hopefully will have more stuff up soon. But honestly, just thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.